Well, all of this begs a really, really important question in my view, Mike. Plainly then, if we have, and we believe we have, the capability to fund, build, obtain, and man something as lethal as these Block 7 Virginias in the future, if we can recognise that it's very evident that Beijing really desperately doesn't want us to have them, that tells you that we shouldn't throw up our hands in despair and say we're helpless, because many people listening to this would probably say, oh, well, let's just go back to sleep and enjoy, eat, drink and be merry because we can't do anything about tomorrow. You're not accepting that position. I'm not accepting that position. And you've set out 10 reasons or 10 things we should do urgently now in the next 2 years. One wonders about the willpower again to get real, but keeping in mind that we're not despairing about the future. By definition, we're saying we can have those very powerful weaponry. The fact that they're effective is evidenced in the response to them out of Beijing. What should we do now? You set it out in your words. What should the priorities be for an incoming government? We're about to have an election that actually understands its first responsibility is to keep us safe.
Well, the first thing I would do is, and people say, well, where's the money coming from? You and I both know, John, how budgeting is done. This government has put 3 percentage points of GDP onto the size of government in 3 years. So you look at the work that people like Chris Richardson and others have done. You look at the national accounts. Off the back of the pandemic, the size of government in terms of the revenue that the Commonwealth collects and then disperses either through its own services and programs or that it disperses to the states and territories and to local government was about 25% of GDP. It is now in the last national accounts 28%. So every year in the last 3 years, we've added 1 percentage point, which is about $25 billion, to the size of government. So there are choices to be made. Now, people might argue the choices that have been made about aged care, childcare, roads, airports, infrastructure, NDIS are valid choices. Of course they are. But that's the point I made in the quote that you read out before. We can have those social benefits, but if you're then going to be coerced, suborned and subjugated through military attack, you lose those social benefits anyway because your overlord takes them off you. So funding 1 percentage point on defence should be eminently doable. It will involve reducing some of those other social programs. But John, it would only get us back to, if let's say we allocated another 1% of GDP tomorrow out of that 28% of GDP that's currently allocated to government, government would still be bigger than it was pre-pandemic. So in other words, there's a lot of fat based on the choices that we've been making about what we want to spend our money on. That's point one. Point two, people then say, but there's such a long lead time. Those Block 7s, for instance, aren't coming anytime soon. True. What you could do is to flesh out and bulk up your current hollow force. So you touched on it with the ADF being 57,000, 14,000 in the Air Force, about 14,000 in the Navy, about 28,000 in the Army. Let's just take one example. Tomorrow, we could double our maritime surveillance capability with our magnificent P8 Poseidons. You'll recall from your time in government, we transitioned from the old P3 Orions to very capable P8 Poseidons, excellent ASW anti-submarine warfare aircraft, maritime surveillance. They've also got a long-range anti-ship missile capability. They are built on a 737 airframe. Now, you're an ex-aviation and transport minister. As you all know, companies that buy a 737 try to keep it in the air as much as possible because that's how they make their money. We have to ground our P8s because of crew limitations. So in other words, the plane flies its long mission, it comes home, the crew is fatigued, you've got to rest the crew, the plane stays in the hangar. If you double tomorrow the pipeline of aircrew, and let's say you move to a crewing ratio of 2 or 2.1 per aircraft, what you would do is that P8 would land, you'd refuel it, put a new crew on it, get it back out over the water, do its surveillance, come back, the crew that had flown the previous mission would be rested up, they'd fly off again. Simple things like that. That's not buying more aircraft. that's getting more utilisation, that's getting more effectiveness and efficiency out of our current airframe. So we can do a lot of that based on our current force. Increase your crewing ratios. Open up your bare bases in the north, stock up your munitions, stock up your inventory. There are lots of things you can do that don't rely on waiting for weapon systems that arrive in the 2030s. Now, there are some things that you can't do. We can't magically conjure up a submarine to cover the capability gap between now and the mid-2030s. So what do we do there? Well, I think we should be exploring, as the Ukrainians have shown brilliantly, military innovations like long-range autonomous underwater drones, which might only have one mission. So unlike those Virginias that might be able to perform 10 missions, you might say, until we get those, I'm going to have a long-range drone, an underwater drone, and all it does is goes off to kill ships. And I accept that it's not going to be able to do any other missions, and I'm going to get 20 of those. There are Australian companies now building those kinds of underwater drones. They cannot get a look in at the Defence Department because they say, well, we don't need these drones because we're getting the Virginias or the AUKUS boat after the Virginias, but we don't need anything immediately. That long-termism, so sometimes people talk about short-termism, that long-termism in defence is a way to kick things down the road, whereas what we should be doing is saying, how do you maximise the lethality, the effectiveness, the utilisation of our current assets in the next 24 months while we wait for these more exquisite, more multifunctional capabilities to arrive in the 30s and 40s?